Number 1. In March of 2003, back when I was 17 years old, my younger brother and I took a weekend camping trip up to Los Padres National Forest. We'd gone there many times with our family for day camping, swimming, and just lounging around. This time though, we went alone for a 2-night camping trip at our favourite spot. It's a place that most locals simply refer to as the Gorge. We'll never forget that weekend, but for all the wrong reasons. We got there Saturday morning at around 9 AM and hiked the 5 miles out to the Gorge. The Gorge is a large swimming hole with a huge 60-foot rock cliff boulder that visitors love to jump from into the deep water below. The jumping rock cliff is very steep, and you have to jump in a very specific location to ensure that you don't hit the rocks protruding from the wall face. The Gorge has many primitive camping areas, and is overall a beautiful, yet isolated place. The first day was very fun, and after a long day of swimming, catching crawdads, jumping from rocks, and just relaxing, we set up our tent, made a fire, and ate our cans of SpaghettiOs and a few crawdads we had cooked for dinner. Towards the end of our dinner, we were visited by a large group of students who were camping farther down the river. They stated that they were students from the Bay Area, and had a few nights left in their almost 2-week-long school camping trip. We offered them some of our chips and snacks, and chatted with them for a bit before they made their hike back to their camping spot. It soon got dark, and my brother and I got ready for bed. My brother was 2 years younger than me, and had a deep fear of isolation. So we slept in the same tent, and agreed that we'd keep our fire burning the entire night to ease his anxieties. We put 5 large logs on the fire, and crept inside our tent and got in our sleeping bags. We both fell asleep very fast, as we were exhausted from the day. Around 2:30 in the morning, we're both awoken by a large splash of water near our tent that puts out our fire. We heard no voices, and couldn't see much from inside our tent. We froze in terror. My brother began to cry, and I tried to calm him down. I told him I'd go outside and investigate, and that everything would be okay. Said our water bladder must have fallen from the tree where it was hung, and that I'm sure it's some kind of coincidence. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped our tent, and stepped outside. I pointed the flashlight over to the fire pit, and saw 4 large men sitting around our fireplace, all staring at me with what I can only describe as expressionless faces. It appeared as though they had slit open our 2-gallon water bladder and tossed it into our fire. I was in shock and didn't know what to say. For about 5 seconds, none of them said anything. We just stared at each other. Then, in a very drunk voice, one of them said, "Get your pussy friend out here too." I then heard my brother hyperventilating and screaming and crying in our tent in a way that made me feel so helpless. I had no weapons, and my brother and I were outnumbered 2 to 1. I asked the men what they wanted, and told them that we could just leave, and that we were sorry if we were taking their camping spot or invading their area. They ignored my questions, and just stood up. That's when I see that 2 of the 4 men were holding something in their hands. They were long, sword-shaped in appearance, like a machete or a short sword, but they looked homemade, primitive. The men yelled at us to get up, and to bring our pussy asses with them. I thought for a second that these might be drunken rangers, merely mad at us for having too big of a fire. But once I glanced at their clothing, and saw their baggy jeans and their black and grey hoodies, I knew we weren't so lucky. I had heard in the past that drug dealers and Mexican cartels had been caught hiding their marijuana plants in the forest, and wondered if these men were of a similar breed, and somehow felt like we were a threat to their crops. We were in fear for our lives. The men didn't touch us or directly threaten us with violence, but the threat was definitely implied in their tone, and I knew we didn't have any choice in the matter. We followed the lead male while the other 3 men fell back behind us. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and was visibly shaking. He then whispered to me that they were walking us in the direction of the 60-foot rock cliff, and that we needed to run. I was petrified and hadn't been paying attention to where they were leading us, but when he said it, I realized he was right. I stopped dead in my tracks and said to the men, "What are you gonna do to us?" The lead male said in a very slurred voice, "Nothing. We're just gonna have some fun with you pussies." I felt like we really had no choice but to do what they said, and hope that they were merely screwing with us, and that this would all be over soon. After about 30 seconds of walking, we arrived at the jumping spot on top of the boulder overlooking the Gorge swimming area. One of the men then asked, "Have you guys ever jumped from here?" I told them yes, I had, but my brother hadn't, as it was a pretty high jump and was very dangerous for most people due to the height of the rocks below. The men laughed and again called my brother a pussy. I told them we weren't pussies, but it just wasn't safe to do it in the dark. The men then formed a half circle around us, and one of them said, "I wanna see. Show us you're not a bunch of pussies." I screamed at them that it was too dangerous at night, and that during the day it was dangerous enough. I told them that there are many rocks down there that you have to avoid, and that if you don't jump precisely correctly, the jump will kill you. I pleaded and pleaded. The men just laughed and took a few steps closer to us. I was beyond scared, and could hear my heart beating through my ears. My brother, by this point, was crying loudly, and saying things I couldn't understand. He was beyond terrified, and so was I. I grabbed his hand and told him that we needed to get away from these men, and that we were in great danger. I told him I had jumped off the boulders into the water before, and knew where to jump, and that if he jumped with me, we'd be okay. I told him I'd use my flashlight to help guide us, and that I'd tell him where to put his feet and how far to jump. The men continued to laugh as we had our conversation, and showed zero humanity or pity. I held my brother's hand, and placed his feet onto a specific spot on the rock ledge, where I remembered jumping from last time I was there months before. I explained to him that I knew he was scared, and so was I, but that we needed to jump out as far as we possibly could, and slightly to the right, otherwise we'd hit the rocks. He was shaking, crying, and kept telling me that he couldn't do it. He then urinated on the floor. The men laughed and continued to berate us. I then told my brother we needed to jump now, and that he'd be okay if he listened to me. I told him that after we jumped, we'd swim to the shore on the right, and would hide in the bushes until daybreak, and go for help then. I then grabbed his hand tightly, and told him that once we hit the water, he needed to tuck his legs and arms in, so that they wouldn't get hurt from the impact of the water. I then instructed him that he needed to swim hard to the surface, as we'd sink pretty far down due to the height of the jump. I grabbed his hand, and we jumped. I pulled him hard with me to ensure that he'd be safe from the rocks below. We fell for what felt like a minute, but in reality was only a few seconds. My brother yelled all the way down in a way I've never heard another human being scream before. Terror, dread, and fear of imminent death reverberated from his voice. I felt helpless and almost forgot where we were for those few seconds. Then we hit the water. As soon as we hit, I lost my grip on my brother's hand, but I did hear a second impact in the water. I swam up towards the surface with all of my energy and took a deep breath. I then listened for my brother to surface, and heard nothing. I panicked and dove down into the water to try and grab him. Just as I dove, I felt his leg brush against my hand and realized he was about to surface. I swam up again and heard my brother. He was crying and kept saying that his arm had hit a rock on the way down and that he couldn't feel it. The men above were laughing again, and I heard one of them say, "They actually fucking made it. Those pussies." I then heard objects splashing in the water around us and realized that they were throwing beer bottles or rocks or some other hard objects at us. I quickly grabbed my brother by his shirt and helped him swim to the nearby shore. The whole time we swam, tons of objects landed dangerously close to us, and I remember thinking, if any of these hit us on the head, it's gonna kill us. I'd lost my flashlight during the fall, and we were in complete darkness. We reached the water's edge, and I pulled my brother to the shore. Objects continued to rain down around us, and we could hear the men yelling and laughing. I'd told my brother that we needed to run. He was crying, and he was holding his injured arm, which he still couldn't feel or use. It had a deep cut around the elbow, and even with just the starlight, we could see it was a serious injury. We stumbled down the tree line and began making our way through the darkness to one of the main trails, using only my memory as a guide. We fell again and again, and were cut by branches and rocks all over our bodies as we wandered about down the overgrown trail. Everything in my body told me to keep going and to get as far away from these men as we could. We walked for many minutes until we could no longer hear the men, and then we waited. I wrapped my brother's arm with my shirt and told him it was all over and that all we had to do now was wait until morning for help. We sat in that spot all night, and my brother cried and shook for hours. I just put my arm around him and patted his head, just like when we were children and he had a panic attack and our parents weren't around. At daybreak, we finally see the severity of his injuries. He had a deep gash in his arm, and his shoulder was obviously dislocated. I helped him hike up the nearby trail, and we walked all the way back to the base camp ranger station. We explained what had happened to the rangers, and they sent 2 armed officers to go and investigate the location. My brother was sent to a nearby hospital for treatment, and I joined him in the ambulance ride over. The rangers never found the men, but did retrieve most of our gear. The scary thing about this incident is that same week, 2 teenage boys were found dead at the bottom of the Gorge jumping area. They had been a part of the school trip group we had met earlier. Their camping ground had been invaded by a group of people with similar machete-like objects who chased them off their camping spot. I'm glad to be alive, and my brother and I have never gone camping alone again, nor have we been back to the Gorge. All we have left from the incident are the scars on my brother's arm, hospital bills, and a lot of trauma. An article about the death of the 2 teenage boys can be found in the description below. I can only hope that their deaths were accidents like the authorities ruled. I didn't find out about their deaths until 7 years later, but was horrified by the similar circumstances and the timing of the 2 events. Number 2. This took place in my home country, on a family farm in the great outdoors. I have an aunt on my father's side of the family. She was childless, even after 10+ years of marriage, and this bothered her greatly. On top of that, she and her husband were always curt towards one another. So, after a while, it became a sort of open secret in my family that my uncle had a girl on his farm, a mistress who he had been seeing behind my aunt's back. This mistress was a lower caste farm worker and his keep. They would stay at her hut, and eventually had a baby daughter together. They were able to keep the child a secret for 2 years before my aunt found out. Now, my aunt was always a bit unhinged, so when she heard the news that her husband had decided to marry the young farmhand and give their daughter his official name, she went crazy. She hired professional hitmen called Ramoshis and told them to break into the young girl's hut at night and kill everyone there. Well, Ramoshis don't kill children, so to finish the job, she turned up at the site, and while the Ramoshis killed the girl, her younger sister, her mother, and her father, my aunt strangled the 2-year-old child in her sleep. Somehow, someone saw the Ramoshis running away from the crime scene and were able to identify my aunt with them. After a prolonged court hearing in which my family lost most of their resources, my aunt was found guilty and was given a life sentence. This was over 25 years ago now, back when my mother was pregnant with me. I'd never even seen this aunt in my entire life. However, I've always been told how much I look like her. She was one of the most good-looking women in our family, so I guess people say it as a compliment. She'll be out of jail in September of this year. She's been told that one of her nieces looks just like her, and apparently she's very interested in meeting me. Fuck my life. Number 3. When I was young, I lived in quite a small town in Queensland, Australia. The whole town was surrounded by bush in every direction for hundreds of kilometers, so we had a lot of room to play. This particular story is about the first time my friends and I got drunk. In the winter, the level of water would drop significantly, enough for us to camp in the riverbed. My best mate's parents owned a pub at the time, so him and I were in charge of gathering the drinks for our little camping trip we had planned. Our mission? To finally pop our drunk cherry. The place we had in mind was out near an old indigenous settlement. We made our way down into the riverbank, which was low on the side we came in, and really high on the other side. You couldn't see through to the other side due to all of the trees on the top, and it was kind of unnerving knowing that someone could be watching us up there and we wouldn't even know. There's about 7 of us in the camp, and our parents have no idea we're out here, or what we're doing. We lied and said we were staying at a friend's place. We set up our camp and build a little shelter for us all to sleep under. We're all set up and start drinking as the sun is setting. Soon it's dark and we're in full swing, mixing drinks, singing songs and throwing stuff in the water, just generally making a whole heap of noise. As we're starting to wind down, one of my friends says he saw something move on the top of the riverbank, on the steep side. We all say that he's full of shit and should calm down, but he's adamant that there's someone up there. So we all start calling out, "Hey, come out you pussy," and other such things, being brave well beyond our years. To our surprise, a bearded man wearing straggly clothes and no shoes comes out of the tree line and stands on the edge and just stares at us. We all go silent, waiting for him to do something, but for about 5 minutes he just stands there and then retreats back into the tree line. We all talk amongst ourselves and get a bit nervous, but we soon forget about it. About an hour later, the guy returns, but he isn't on the bank anymore. Instead, he's coming out of the shadows from the other side of the bank and entering our camp. He comes over and stands by the fire, just joins our group of 12-year-old kids and stands there. We're all officially a bit scared and don't really know what to do or say, so we just sit there in silence. Eventually, one of my friends gathers up the courage to speak to him. "G'day, mate. How are you? You okay?" The guy just stares at my friend, and then starts staring at each of us in turn, spending a little bit of time on each of us. My friend tries again. "Hey, are you okay? What's your name?" The man snaps his head back at my friend and stares at him wide-eyed for at least 2 minutes before answering. Without blinking, he says in a raspy whisper, "That's none of your fucking business." And I swear to God, he hisses like a cat. Then this guy jumps back, screaming and staring at the fire like it had just appeared or something, and runs off up the steep bank in record time. It was impossible to get up this thing, so we all stand there, speechless. We decide that it's best to just stoke the fire up, because it's about a 19-kilometer walk in the pitch black back to town, and we weren't confident on that, so stoke the fire we did. We sat up for as long as we could, keeping watch, not really talking. We all eventually dozed off, one by one. When we woke up in the morning, everything was gone. All of our alcohol, all our bags, all our shoes, all our blankets, everything. The creepy thing was that none of us woke up while someone robbed us blind, and there wasn't a single footprint. We were sleeping in wettish sand, so there should have been footprints everywhere, but there were none, not even our own. It looked like we hadn't even been there, Needless to say, we bailed and ran most of the way back to our town. Our feet were all cut up and messy by the time we got back. We never did tell our parents about that camping trip. If you guys want me to add more stories about my hometown, I can. Scariest stuff of my life happened there. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. Well, for those of you who came and listened to my recent Q&A, I hope you enjoyed it. And for this one, I wanted to bring you a few good stories and, have a nice collection. I think this was a good mix, and if you at least found it somewhat enjoyable, then be sure to do some naughty things with that like button. I've got a couple of ideas for my next upload, guys. I'm just deciding on which one to go with at the moment. But whichever it is, I'm planning on having it out in the next 3 or 4 days or so. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Anyway, until then, Lazy Legion, you all stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark. That's none of your fucking business. 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 Australian accents. Fucking hell. That's none of your fucking business. That's none of your fucking business.